Our first presentation this afternoon is on behalf of the group Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump. Ms. Fernandez, please begin.
Good afternoon, members of the Joint Review Panel. My name is Beverly Fernandez. I am the spokesperson for Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump. Thank you for granting our group the opportunity to address the panel on this matter of national and international importance. My comments today are directed not just to members of this panel, but to members of the public and the media who may be viewing these proceedings via the webcast. Our group, Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump, is a non-profit organization whose purpose is supported by more than 34,000 petition signatories, plus an ever-increasing number of Canadians and Americans. We are independent without any financial interests tied to the nuclear industry. We are not full-time activists, but are a group of everyday Canadians who have professions, have homes, have children, pay taxes, and who together with thousands of other people are deeply concerned about OPG's proposal to build this DGR. Burying radioactive nuclear waste 1 kilometer from the shore of the Great Lakes, the largest body of fresh water in the world, and the supply of drinking water for 40 million people in 2 countries, defies common sense. It is imperative that we understand the profound importance, the absolute necessity and sanctity of fresh water. Fresh drinkable water is required for life on this planet. Without it, life cannot exist. Water is life. It is that simple. Enter Ontario Power Generation. They want to bury the most toxic, lethal, dangerous, and long-lasting poisonous material humans have ever created, right beside the life-giving waters of the Great Lakes. And they cannot and will not provide any guarantee that this nuclear waste dump will not leak and contaminate the Great Lakes. Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump believes that Canadians and Americans have a duty, a profound and unwavering responsibility to be responsible stewards of this most precious natural resource, the Great Lakes, 95% of North America's drinking water. Today, I stand before you, not as the voice of one person, but with the voices and support of 34,000 concerned citizens standing with me. 34,000 citizens who have signed the Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump petition. 34,000 citizens all in agreement that no DGR to bury nuclear waste should be constructed anywhere in the Great Lakes Basin. I would like to focus on 3 key areas of concern: site selection, public consultation, and alleged public support. Site selection. We believe that Ontario Power Generation's selection of the proposed DGR site 1 kilometer from the shore of Lake Huron is highly controversial and should be a major source of concern for governments and all citizens of Canada and the United States, as well as this panel. OPG's Environmental Impact Statement submission, written requests to information requests from the Joint Panel, and statements by OPG officials in the press all confirm that no other sites were considered. OPG's Environmental Impact Statement contains 3,432 pages. Written justification for choosing this proposed site is contained in the equivalent of 1 single page. OPG's comment on achievability and acceptability of an alternative site option is reported in a single word: unknown. This panel, and indeed anyone, can conclude that OPG has no idea whether an actual alternate site, not some vague notion of a conceptual generic site, but an actual site, would be environmentally safer and of less risk to millions of people. The fact that no other sites were considered is a shocking admission. OPG has, on the record, failed to perform the most basic alternate site selection due diligence. The siting of a garbage dump in Canada requires that numerous sites be considered and that the most suitable site be chosen. In comparison, OPG is proposing a single site beside North America's greatest freshwater supply without investigating any other locations. Does that sound responsible? The EIS guidelines direct the proponent to consider the siting of the DGR in a location outside the existing site as an alternative means. The panel asked OPG in an information request to provide further information on the location, salient features, evaluation criteria used, and a summary presentation of the comparison and selection process for alternative locations considered for the DGR. OPG's response to the panel speaks in vague terms about considering other sites at a, quote, conceptual level, end quote. But in the end, they are forced to admit that OPG did not actively solicit other potential host communities or undertake geoscientific studies at other sites. Gord Sullivan, OPG's DGR manager, states, quote, "We have a willing host with Kincardine. If it wasn't there, then OPG would do a lot more site investigation work," end quote. So only one site was considered because Kincardine apparently was a willing host. Well, don't you think that the risk that Canadians and all North Americans are being asked to accept deserves a lot more site investigation work? This is not good enough. One does not select a site for radioactive nuclear waste beside a town because a town who is being paid large sums of money by the proponent says okay. Also, let's be clear, the EIS guidelines did not ask OPG to consider a generic site for purposes of comparison, yet this is exactly what OPG has done. The EIS guidelines required OPG to consider the siting of the DGR in a location outside the existing site. OPG failed to do this. Saying that they performed some conceptual analysis of a generic site is fancy technical language that seeks to justify their failure to consider other locations off the Bruce site. OPG did not do what they were required to do, and no fancy technical language will change that fact. We are dealing with real radioactive waste, not a conceptual version. It is not reasonable or acceptable for OPG to simply say unknown to the question of the availability and acceptability of alternative sites. Nor is it reasonable, acceptable, or credible to cite a conceptual analysis of a generic site as evidence that they considered other sites. OPG has not complied with the EIS guidelines. All Canadians and Americans deserve to know that OPG's site selection process extremely carefully, thoroughly, and diligently considered all available alternatives, and that the site selected represented the optimal site from an environmental and safety perspective. This has not happened. The public and this panel will never know if the Bruce site is the optimal site from an environmental and safety perspective. OPG has not brought a compliant case to this panel, and as a result, we urge this panel to recommend to the Federal Minister of the Environment that OPG's plan is fatally flawed and fundamentally deficient in meeting the requirements set forth in the EIS guidelines, and therefore must be rejected. Public consultation. Very few Canadians and Americans have had the opportunity to know about this matter. To be clear, OPG has a legal responsibility to engage the public in a meaningful way. This doesn't just mean informing people about the project, it means actually inquiring and listening to their views, having a two-way dialogue. Meaningful public participation also means ensuring that citizens, governments, and environmental groups are notified well in advance so that they have time to properly investigate and provide comments on the matter. Letting people know about this issue at the 11th hour does not constitute meaningful public consultation. In examining OPG's communication program, it is clear that the bulk of OPG's outreach was in the local communities in Bruce County. Of course, many of the people that OPG is reaching in local communities are OPG NWMO, or Bruce Power employees and retirees who receive a salary or pension from the nuclear industry. This places them in an actual or potential conflict of interest position with respect to this matter. OPG contacted elected officials in Kincardine and adjacent communities. These same communities are receiving millions of dollars from OPG under a hosting agreement that requires them to express their support for OPG's DGR in exchange for the financial payments. Is this consistent with free and independent consultation with communities by OPG? We know that if the communities fail to show their support for the DGR, these payments could be cut off. It is one thing to pay for support. It is quite another thing to earn your support freely from an informed, independent, and consenting community. OPG engaged in some limited outreach in Michigan. OPG has acknowledged that comments received from these Michigan-based stakeholders noted concern with the DGR project because of its proximity to Lake Huron and the perceived risk of potential contamination of the Great Lakes. But did OPG consult with New York, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Minnesota, and Indiana? What about Quebec? And what about the other Ontario communities outside of Bruce County? We can't find evidence anywhere in OPG's submission that OPG engaged in meaningful public consultation with individuals, organizations, government officials and agencies, or anyone in any of these Great Lake communities or states. It should be clear to the panel that all of these parties have a stake in the outcome of this proposal and should have been consulted. It is not difficult to imagine that all Great Lakes states would be concerned about any proposal that may create potential risk to their drinking water. Of course, if you don't contact them and tell them about the proposal, they won't know anything about it and won't have an opportunity to provide their views. Under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, it is the responsibility of the Joint Review Panel, and not OPG, to determine who is an interested party. We submit that it is logical, reasonable, and responsible that when considering a high-stakes issue such as this, bearing the most dangerous substance humans have ever produced in close proximity to North America's most vital water resource, that this panel must exercise its authority and make a positive determination that the relevant interested parties have not been consulted in this case. The list of interested parties should have included 1, all the municipalities situated on Lake Huron and the other Great Lakes, representing many of the 40 million Canadians and American citizens who rely on the Great Lakes for their drinking water. 2, representatives of all First Nations people living in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River region. 3, the appropriate governments of the 8 Great Lakes states and provincial governments. And 4, the public. In the Great Lakes region, there is a group called the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. This is a group of 106 mayors representing 16 million people living in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region. Any reasonable person would view this group as an interested stakeholder in any proposal for the siting of a nuclear waste repository on the Great Lakes. What we have learned and what you have heard in their submission earlier this week is that the Great Lakes Group only became aware of the DGR in late 2012. If OPG was truly interested in engaging in meaningful public participation with key stakeholders, how is it possible that OPG failed to meaningfully engage with this important group early on in the process? This group includes 2 of Canada's largest cities, Toronto and Montreal, and the 3rd most populous city in the United States, Chicago. This group has been in existence throughout the 7 years that OPG has been engaged in so-called consultation with interest-based stakeholders. Effective public consultation requires both informing and seeking input. It is clear that this important group was informed at the 11th hour and was not given an adequate amount of time to provide input. OPG had 7 years to consult in a meaningful way with this important Great Lakes group and failed to do so. We submit that OPG's stakeholder consultation has failed to meet the guidelines for meaningful public participation, as required under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Again, OPG has failed to comply with the guidelines. Its minimal communication program is fundamentally deficient and fatally flawed, and we urge this panel to reject OPG's claims of an effective consultation program. Again, OPG has not brought a compliant case before this panel. Alleged public support. OPG written evidence presented to the panel includes the following statements. Quote, much of the input from the general public and key stakeholders post-submission continues to reflect strong, consistent support for the DGR project. Stakeholder opposition to the DGR project, which has existed in isolated pockets from the initiation of the project, has become much more vocal, and several new local NGO groups have formed. Many stakeholders continue to provide encouraging comments, and opposition to the DGR is being voiced by small pockets of local individuals, NGOs, and national NGOs, end quote. We simply cannot allow these statements to go unchallenged because, quite frankly, they are inaccurate and inconsistent with the facts before us. OPG's opposition to OPG's plan is not, as it claims, contained in small pockets. The facts are that opposition is broad-based, spans from coast to coast in 2 nations and outside their borders, and continues to grow daily. This panel heard an oral statement of opposition from the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. This group represents 16 million people, half the population of Canada. This group unequivocally opposes OPG's plan. Formal resolutions have been passed in states of Michigan and Ohio and in the province of Ontario, opposing construction of the DGR. The combined population of citizens living in communities that have passed resolutions is over 3 million people. A resolution was unanimously passed by the Michigan State Senate. 2 resolutions have recently been introduced into the Michigan House of Representatives. In the coming days, we expect more towns, cities, and municipalities in Canada and the US will follow suit and oppose the DGR as they become aware of OPG's proposal. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine, a highly respected international organization of physicians and scientists, has passed a resolution opposing the construction of the DGR or any nuclear waste repository anywhere in the Great Lakes Basin, stating that, and I quote, the proposed DGR poses a significant health hazard to millions of people, end quote. The Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, an important voice for the environmental health in Canada, is also on record opposing the DGR. Importantly, we would like to share with the panel information about the Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump petition. Our petition is directed at the Federal Minister of the Environment and states, quote, we call on you to refuse Ontario Power Generation's application to build an underground deep geological repository for radioactive nuclear waste within the municipality of Kincardine on the shores of Lake Huron that would threaten the drinking water of 40 million people, 40 million Canadians and Americans. We stand with concerned citizens in opposition to the building of an underground nuclear waste dump anywhere in the Great Lakes Basin, end quote. There are now more than 34,000 signatories agreeing with this position. Signatories include citizens from every Canadian province and territory, all 50 US states, and 96 countries around the globe. All are saying no to OPG's plan. The more than 34,000 individuals who have signed the Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump petition are not, quote, small pockets, end quote, of local individuals as OPG would have you believe. They are prominent and distinguished Canadians, companions, officers, and members of the Order of Canada, doctors, over 630. Scientists, geologists, professors, lawyers, teachers, First Nations chiefs and peoples, a former Assistant Deputy Attorney General Ontario and Deputy Minister of the Environment Ontario, church leaders, a former member of the Seaborne Panel, members of Canada's Armed Forces, Canadian and US politicians, and citizens of Canada and the United States and of other countries of the world. Some notable petition signatories thus far include Dr. David Suzuki, an award-winning scientist, environmentalist, broadcaster, Companion of the Order of Canada, holder of 25 honorary degrees, and recipient of the Right Livelihood Award, the Alternative Nobel Prize. Hunyan Hopgood, Michigan State Senator. Sarah Roberts, Michigan State Representative. Lois Wilson, a former member of the Seaborne Panel. Farley Mowat, Canadian author. Robert Bateman, Canadian artist. Does all of this sound like small and isolated pockets? In stark contrast, the 4,067 individuals in the municipality of Kincardine who apparently indicated support to the telephone question posed to them is itself a small pocket. A more accurate description would be that support for the DGR is being voiced by a, quote, small pocket, unquote, of very local municipalities who are receiving financial payments for their support. We urge this panel to consider the Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump petition comments of doctors, professors, lawyers, teachers, First Nations chiefs, all very learned and highly respected citizens in society, and all directly contradicting statements made by OPG to the panel that, quote, much of the input from the general public and key stakeholders post-submission continues to reflect strong, consistent support for the DGR project, end quote. I would like to read you a small selection of these comments so you can appreciate what some of these learned and highly respected citizens think and are saying. The comments paint a very different picture than what you have been told by OPG. Dr. Amy Dean, President of the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, quote, the health and wellness of citizens in the United States and Canada depends on clean water, air, and food. Placing a nuclear waste repository on the shore of Lake Huron puts all our health at risk, end quote. Dr. William Neal, Emeritus, Professor of Geology, Grand Valley State University, quote, as a geologist, I am very aware that the proposed site threatens a vital water resource. As a citizen who lives only 15 miles from a great lake from which our water supply is derived, I am extremely concerned and cannot fathom that anyone would consider this, end quote. Dr. David Suzuki, award-winning scientist, environmentalist, and Companion of the Order of Canada, quote, I am shocked that we still operate under a long-discarded idea that we can solve our planetary pollution problem by adopting the practice of out of sight, out of mind. We have to stop using the ground, air, or water as a repository for toxic wastes. It only provides a short-term illusion that we have solved what will become a long-term disaster, end quote. Rod McLeod, QC, former Chief Crown Prosecutor Ontario and former Deputy Minister of the Environment Ontario. Quote, as a former Deputy Minister Environment Ontario, I think the OPG proposal is very unwise, end quote. Chief Louise Hillier, Caldwell First Nation, quote, nuclear waste has no business being dumped/hidden anywhere near waterways or where the waste could leach into the surrounding ground or the water tables underground. With all of OPG's money, you just know they have the means to do research and to find an environmentally safe way to deal with the waste they manufactured, end quote. Of the 34 citizens who are now voicing opposition, over 11,000 have left comments on the petition that uniformly, eloquently, passionately, and thoughtfully agree that burying the most toxic and lethal substance that humans have ever created within 1 kilometer of the drinking water supply of 40 million people in 2 countries defies common sense and should not be permitted. It is very clear that OPG has not brought this panel a strong case. The highest of standards should apply in a matter of this magnitude. This proposal before you clearly does not meet high standards. It does not even meet the basic guidelines. OPG failed to adhere to the basic principles of due diligence, and this proposal poses unacceptable risks that can and must be avoided. There was no process that considered any other sites. This panel's own consultant, Dr. Dunker, has characterized OPG's analysis as not credible, not defensible, and not reliable. OPG's consultation program and engagement of interested parties was wholly inadequate. A matter of this magnitude demands the involvement of all Great Lakes stakeholders. OPG ought to have known this and should have acted accordingly. The safety and sanctity of the fresh water of the Great Lakes must not be compromised for the sake of the convenience of financial interest or exposed to avoidable risks based on promises that cannot be fulfilled and assurances that cannot be proven. OPG's statement, quote, not likely to result in any significant residual adverse effects to the human health or the environment, including Lake Huron and the Great Lakes, end quote, is not good enough. We urge this panel to pay heed to the voices of elected officials representing millions of citizens who are speaking out against OPG's plan by passing resolutions. We urge this panel to pay heed to the words of the Great Lakes Mayors Group, representing 16 million people. We urge this panel to pay heed to the words of some of our most highly educated and respected members of society who are opposing this plan. We urge this panel to pay heed to the impassioned pleas of the 34,000 citizens so far who have voiced their opposition by signing the Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump petition. We urge this panel to pay heed to all these voices because OPG has neglected to do so. OPG cannot demonstrate strong public support. Instead, today, there is very strong and overwhelming public opposition against this proposal. Panelists, OPG may be anticipating a favorable recommendation to the federal government. However, they have failed in all the basic tests and requirements for this application. This is an experiment that will impact 7,000 generations. The enormity of this matter you've been asked to preside over is unprecedented. Your recommendations could lead to a decision that will impact 40 million people in 2 countries. Protecting the environment, protecting the Great Lakes, protecting human life is paramount to all other considerations. OPG's proposal cannot be permitted to risk violating these fundamental and overriding principles. These principles must be adhered to. We urge you to recommend to the Federal Minister of the Environment that OPG's proposal be rejected. All life in the Great Lakes Basin demands nothing less.
Thank you, Ms. Fernandez. Panel members, did you have some questions? Ms. Fernandez, I just have a couple of questions for you, and then we'll see if there are questions from the floor. Is your group suggesting that there is an alternative definition of the phrase that has been used a lot already, which is the willing host community?
I think what our group is saying is that this issue is one of enormous importance, and that it is not sufficient for a small Northern Ontario town, many of whose members are employed by the nuclear industry, to say yes, we will have this buried here. What we are saying is that this is an issue largely for Canadians and Americans.
Thank you. Uh, uh, Regarding your concerns around public consultation and notification, the panel would be interested in your organization's suggestions regarding what else could have been done to ensure that you didn't hear at the 11th hour.
Well, I think the easiest way to ensure that all Canadians and all Americans are aware of this plan is to work with the media to ensure that all Canadians and Americans are fully aware of what is happening.
And by that you mean OPG making sure they were reaching out to a very broad range of media?
Yes, and to everyone in the Great Lakes Basin. I would comment that our organization has only been in existence for a very short time, approximately 9 months. And in that length of time, we have thus far been able to reach out to 34,000 Canadians and Americans and people from around the world who have signed our petition. We are not a multi-billion-dollar corporation. We are a small group of volunteers. And our reach has been fairly substantial in that short period of time.
And Ms. Fernandez, the way you've been able to do that is primarily the internet?
We have used social media, yes, and more recently we have been able to engage the Canadian and American media.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question on this topic to OPG. Did you, OPG, conduct formal stakeholder mapping? And if so, did you seek input to the initial sort of master list of potential interested parties from a cross-section, perhaps outside of OPG, just to make sure you had covered all your bases? And that would include the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, just as an example of a group you might have consulted with when you did your stakeholder mapping.
Kevin Powers for the record. We did in fact do stakeholder mapping, and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative has been on that stakeholder map. We first approached the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative in 2009, first through their executive and then through the administration in order to make a presentation to them on the project. We did not hear anything back from them on that. We approached them again in 2010 in order to have a presentation done at their annual general meeting, and we were told that we were not, they did not want us to be there.
And Mr. Powers, were there other Canadian and American organizations around the Great Lakes that you approached in a similar manner?
We did reach out to a number of organizations, especially governments throughout the Great Lakes. We have submitted information on our outreach activities to Michigan, for example, as well as to Washington.
Did you reach out to any communities in Quebec or in elsewhere in Ontario?
The Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative represents municipalities around the Great Lakes, and so it was through them that we attempted to reach them.
Thank you. As the panel continues to be concerned about your experience of the lack of consultation and your experience, as you said, 11th hour. So beyond social media, we're just seeking what else could have been done, because we, of course, are aware through our process that there were public notices, there were news releases, there were regular notifications of a very long list of interested parties. So we're just a little puzzled, and we would like to have a little more clarity on exactly what happened here and why so many people say they had never heard of it.
Well, I think what Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump as our very first initiative is we put a digital billboard up on the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto. And that billboard message also appeared randomly in other areas in downtown Toronto. If you want to reach people to let them know something, certainly a very visual billboard is a good idea. There is also the possibility of smaller billboards that we had investigated, such as in the subway areas, in major areas in downtown Toronto that are traveled by large number of commuters, Union Station, Royal Bank Plaza. You can put posters on backs of buses and taxis. Unfortunately, Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump was not able to afford to do this because the money that we raised was raised from concerned friends, neighbors, and relatives. But OPG certainly has sufficient money to do that. I would also suggest ads in newspapers. And these should have been American newspapers, Canadian newspapers. Once again, these are things that we considered, but once again, we did not have the funding to do that.
So OPG, you've just heard the list from Ms. Fernandez. Can you remind the panel again of that list? What did you actually implement?
Kevin Powers, for the record. We have had an ongoing engagement campaign over the past 10 years, which has included at least 800 different sessions with the public. It has included advertising. It has included social media. It has included websites as well as presentations to the public.
Thank you. Dr. Muick, you have a question?
Yes, I would like to direct towards CNSC for clarification, because a statement was made that under Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, it is the responsibility of the Joint Review Panel and not OPG to determine who is an interested party. Could you clarify that for me?
Patsy Thompson for the record. I think, Dr. Muick, you're referring perhaps to the new CA 2012. And so this project was started under the previous Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and there was no such limitation in terms of definition of stakeholders. So the approach that we expected OPG to take was a broad approach, using what has been discussed earlier in terms of stakeholder mapping, identifying relevant parties that had an interest or could be affected by the project. The public consultation expectations of the CNSC have been essentially the same for a number of years in terms of assessments done under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, where the expectation is that the relevant stakeholders, members of the public, are engaged through a variety of means, including not just information sessions and mail-outs, but also active engagement in public information sessions and opportunities for people to provide their input. CNSC staff has attended open houses organized by OPG as observers, and we have found that what OPG has been doing and has done for this project to be good practice. The CNSC since 2006, when this project first came to the CNSC with a letter of intent and a project, also held public information sessions and open houses for guidelines, and we have also had a broad approach to reaching out and announcing and advertising those activities. We found, for example, in the spring of 2006, when the first consultation was done on the guidelines for the track report that with the Commission proceeding in October 2006, that a delegation from Michigan did attend the public open houses and provided their input into the guidelines and the consultation. And so certainly at that time we were able to reach out to regions outside of the immediate region of the project.
Dr. Thompson, perhaps I didn't put my question quite clearly enough. Maybe.
I think I can help you out, Dr. Mueg. I think what the panel is seeking is for the record to explain the panel's own process with respect to identifying the people that are receiving information and can become involved in this process. So I would ask our co-manager, Ms. Miles, to provide some clarity for the record.
Thank you, Dr. Swanson. So for this project, when we start out a project, even before the panel's appointed, what we do is work with the proponent and try to see if they have any lists of people who have offered to be contacted. We sent, for this project, we took some of the people from the list that OPG was comfortable that they had the permission to provide the names. We went to them and said, would you like to be on the list of interested parties for the Deep Geologic Repository review? And so all of the communications material that went out prior to the panel's appointment and then continued after the panel's appointment detailed that if you wanted to be included on the list of interested parties, to let us know. We had a specific mailbox that was used for that purpose. So the list kept compiling. When reporters would contact the communications advisor, she would tell them that she was going to put them on to the interested parties. So it's our best attempt of collecting as many people as we can and then sending them information at important parts in the process. Anytime the panel had a news release, a public notice, major step in the process, a large amount of information received from OPG, for example, a notification would be sent out to that interested parties list. Now, unfortunately, it was called an interested parties list. At that time, it wasn't. Interested parties wasn't a defined term in the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. So it was, I guess, a small p interested parties list.
Thank you. Were there any other questions from the panel for Ms. Fernandez? Okay, so I understand we have participants with questions. Mr. Mann.
Thank you, Dr. Swanson. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge your wonderful support staff and wonderful technical staff and wonderful security staff that have assisted all of us, frankly, in participating in this procedure this week, and I very much want to thank them all for that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
I'd like, through you, Dr. Swanson, to ask this. Should there not be a public inquiry into why the OPP approached citizen participants in this DGR process? I myself was approached by the OPP, and I found it extremely chilling and intimidating to my submissions and participations, particularly since I was challenging the government and challenging the process. I'm asking that question to be relayed to OPG, CSNC, and Ms. Fernandez, if possible.
OPG, you may want to just repeat some of your statements from before.
Lori Swamy, for the record. OPG is well aware and encourages public participation in the process, whether it's through the hearing process or whether it's through our consultation process. OPG cannot speak to the matter of the OPP and their interest or not in this particular project and their activities surrounding these hearings.
As Patsy Thompson for the record, as I mentioned at the start of this afternoon's session, the CNSC actively discouraged the OPP from proceeding in this manner. Our point of view is that this would be perceived by people wanting to intervene in this process as harassment and intimidation. I've been attending commission hearings and public information sessions since the mid-90s, and in the previous life before that I've worked in small communities for a variety of projects, and for many people who aren't accustomed to appearing in front of panels like this, it's intimidating to start with, to take someone who isn't used to speaking in public to have the courage to come up and speak on things they feel very strongly about. And so this type of action from the Ontario Police we thought was totally inappropriate.
Thank you. Ms. Fernandez, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I would just say that I would agree that to many people a visit from the police would be very intimidating, and I would speak to perhaps that is speaks to the success of the outreach that Stop the Great Lakes Nuclear Dump has had via social media and via the actions that we have taken, in that we, a small group of volunteers, have been able to solicit the opinions of 11,000 people, written opinions, written comments, in addition to their signatures on the petition.
Thank you.
One other question, Dr. Swanson, for Ms. Fernandez. What public consultation, through you, Dr. Swanson, what public consultation related to the siting and hosting of the DGR for low and intermediate waste was done in the twin nuclear town of Saugeen Shores, where Ms. Fernandez resides?
Ms. Fernandez?
Yes, although I do, Beverly Fernandez for the record, although I do reside in the town, I was completely unaware of the Kincardine Nuclear Waste Repository until last summer. So what I would just have to say that whatever outreach was done was not effective, because I live in that community and was completely unaware.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Ms. Joanne Martin, please.
Good afternoon. Joanne Martin for the record. So I just want to take umbrage with that Toronto Star article. I was the lady they were referring to in the pajamas, and it was really a pretty pink nightie. It was not pajamas. So I have to say that the reporter got it wrong, and it had embroidery on it. So just saying. So anyway, leaving the nightie aside, my background is communications with Ministry of the Ontario Ministry of Health and Health and Welfare Canada, when it was still Health and Welfare, and also with La Brasserie Molson in advertising in Montreal and also in Toronto. So I guess my question is, how did we manage over 10 years of planning this DGR not to have a more effective public campaign to tell people what was going on? If I tried to sell beer with that kind of a campaign, I don't think I'd be successful. And I have lived all my life, my mother lived all her life, and my grandmother at Lake Huron Cottages. And yet we didn't know, and when I was bringing my family up in Burlington, we didn't know about this repository. And I guess I'm just wondering, what could we expect how could we not hear about this if it was a really dedicated campaign to getting this out to, well, not just to Kincardine, but to, all the Great Lakes communities, all the people in Ontario, Canadians, because it's really a referendum question because it's a very small amount of people that are going to be deciding this. And to me, that is not democratic. So my question is, how did we have such a small and insignificant media relations and public relations and information program?
I think I'll direct this question to you, Mr. Powers. The panel is certainly aware of the list of activities, and you reported on it extensively in the EIS and in appendices. So I was wondering if you could maybe help us out with maybe some of the lessons learned, including what we're learning during the hearing, and perhaps provide your thoughts.
Kevin Powers for the record. We do, as throughout the 10 years of this campaign, we do continue to learn, and we continue to evolve and adapt based on what we have learned. As we have received input from various stakeholders on their issues and concerns, we have tried to address those in our materials. When stakeholders we found we could not engage them, whether it was through one-on-one briefings or beach associations, there were newsletters, the internet, and so one of the learnings is that you need multiple lines of offense, I guess is the term I would use, to try and help reach as many people as possible, and that first outreach is just the first step in a process of engagement and a process that ends with a dialogue and consultation.
Thank you. Ms. Martin?
I just wanted to ask, then given what has happened so far and that there's so little actual knowledge about the proposal, is there an opportunity for OPG, and is there a requirement for OPG to do a much broader public relations and paid advertising campaign to let the broader group of people who would be interested and who are actually stakeholders know what is being proposed? Because it just seems like even with these proceedings, we don't know how many people are actually following this, because I don't see any big ads in the papers, and just the two little newspapers that come out here are once a week. I don't see any ads in the Globe and Mail or anywhere else directing people to view this procedure, which is absolutely critical.
I think I heard a recommendation in there, Ms. Martin, but probably not a question.
Well,
so was there a question in there somewhere?
Yes, the question is, will OPG be required to do a better job of marketing the information about this before any licensing is approved or a recommendations made?
That's, I think, that will be something the panel will be considering.
Thank you very
for
much.
our report.
Thank you so much.
The next question is from Mr. Patrick Gibbons.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Over the past few months, I've been looking through some of the environmental statements that have been made, and the results of the open houses seem very poor. An average of about 12 people will show up at an open house. I know that the panel saw that in February as well. Other than that, a mention is made of paid focus groups, maximum 9 people, paid $60. My question is this: did OPG consider having town hall meetings or a series of town hall meetings so that the masses of people during the summer months could attend?
Mr. Powers?
Kevin Powers for the record. Since 2002, we've held approximately 44 open houses. We've held 30 briefings with beach associations, as well as at least 120 speaking engagements.
Mr. Powers, but were any of those town hall meetings?
Kevin Powers, for the record, could you define what you mean by a town hall meeting?
Perhaps, Mr. Gibbons, what did you mean by that?
Well, as an example, a group that I belong to has had 6 events in the last 2 summers, and we've had anywhere up to 500 people at those events. So I mean an event that we advertise, and we don't have any money either. Our group doesn't have any money, so it's done on the cheap with posters that even some businesses will post, despite the fact that it may be going against some of their customers. Posters, advertisements on a web page, Facebook. So it's an open meeting, open dialogue, where all points of view can be discussed.
So, Mr. Powers, I think from what I'm gathering from Mr. Gibbons, this would be more of an event that OPG would organize and convene, but you would perhaps, for example, a town hall meeting, in my experience is you'd have several points of view up on the podium, like a panel discussion or a symposium, and there would be a very free exchange of ideas, similar to what we're having during the hearing.
Kevin Powers, for the record, at the open houses that we have held, these are free discussions where all the presentation is given, and then people are allowed to and are encouraged to discuss matters and bring up different points of view.
Mr. Gibbons, did you have any follow-up?
I don't think that really answered the question in terms of a panel with different points of view being expressed publicly. I think what Mr. Powers is talking about is a one-to-one discussion in a corner of a room with one OPG worker or NWMO worker and the interested party. So he didn't really speak to open house. I'm sorry, he spoke to open houses, but not town hall meetings.
Mr. Powers, did Mr. Gibbons give an accurate representation of how your open houses are run?
Kevin Powers, I don't think that that's quite the case in our meetings. We do a presentation, but then the audience members are free to ask questions, and we do provide what answers we can.
Ms. Jill Taylor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Following on the second to last presentation, I was also contacted by the OPP, and I did feel intimidated, but I am still here. And I'm still willing to ask questions and to be an intervener. Found it very upsetting. I have been the chair of an Ontario panel, and I've never experienced anything like this on any of my 6 years as a chair or a member of a provincial panel. I wanted to ask about polling that occurred in 2003 that was a major test of public opinion in Kincardine and in the surrounding areas. It was a poll that was conducted, it was a public attitude analysis. There were 751 survey results, including Kincardine residents, residents in neighboring communities, 32 businesses, 54 tourists, and no cottage owners who were tabulated. I wanted to ask Madam Chair if anyone knows who paid for that public attitude poll in 2003.
OPG, would you care to respond? I believe, Ms. Taylor, you may be referring to what was called in the EIS the Public Attitude Research.
That's right. It was conducted under the IAS.
Right.
Lori Swamy, for the record, as part of the environmental impact statement, we would have paid for such polling.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Ms. Fernandez, I believe that was all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.